What made an entire community of parents riot? When I picked up my 8-year-old son Ethan from school, he was sitting in the office with wet pants, shaking, and wouldn't make eye contact. His fingernails were bloody from scratching at something. The secretary said he'd had a difficult day. When we got to the car, Ethan finally whispered, "Dark room again, mommy." I thought he meant time out, but then I saw the raw marks on his wrists. Ethan, an autistic child who usually never stops talking about dinosaurs, hadn't said another word. He wet the bed 3 times that night, something he hadn't done in years. I started asking questions. Ethan's aide, Miss Patricia, said he'd been acting out and needed behavioral intervention, but when I pressed for details, she got defensive. I decided to drop by school unannounced at lunch. The principal said he was in his calm down space and that I couldn't see him. I threatened to call the police. They brought Ethan to me after 45 minutes, but something felt wrong. That afternoon, I gave Ethan my old phone with a recording app. If they put you in the dark room again, press the big red button. 3 days later, I finally got it. 4 hours of audio. I felt sick, crying, begging, scratching sounds, followed by long stretches of silence. You could hear him asking for the bathroom, for water, for his mom, but the worst part was hearing the adults. "Get in there, Ethan. Stop being dramatic." And location clues. Take him down to B12. Make sure the janitor's closet by the boiler room is empty. Armed with this information, I knew I had to see this room myself. The next week, I waited in the parking lot until the fire alarm went off for their monthly drill. While everyone was filing out to the soccer field, I slipped in through the side door near the gym that they always prop open. I made my way down to the basement, my heart pounding as I followed the signs to the boiler room. There it was, a door marked B12 storage. The scratches on the inside were at child height, a bucket in the corner, the smell of urine. I took photos of everything. Other parents started approaching me in the parking lot after they overheard me asking questions. My daughter said kids disappear during class. My son mentioned screaming from the basement. One mother showed me photos her older child had drawn in therapy, a stick figure in a black box labeled the bad kid room. I scheduled an emergency IEP meeting. I came prepared with photos of the room, the marks on my son, and written statements from other parents. The principal, Mr. Davidson, sat there with the school district lawyer. "Mrs. Cooper, we have protocols for managing disruptive behavior. This is a standard quiet room." I slammed down my son's diagnosis papers. "He's autistic, not disruptive. He has sensory processing disorder. Locking him in a dark closet is torture." The lawyer spoke up. "No one is locking anyone anywhere. This is a voluntary cool-down space." I pulled out my phone and showed them a video another parent had taken of a teacher physically dragging a struggling child to that room. "Voluntary?" The lawyer's face went pale. Mr. Davidson cleared his throat. "We'll need to review that footage." I stood up, my hands shaking with rage. "Review it? That's my baby you've been torturing. He's 8 years old." My voice cracked. "He still sleeps with a dinosaur nightlight, and you've been locking him in a pitch-black closet like he's some kind of animal." The room was silent. Miss Patricia wouldn't even look at me. That's when I went nuclear. I called CPS from the meeting room. "I need to report systematic child abuse at Central Elementary. Multiple autistic children are being locked in isolation rooms without food, water, or bathroom access." The principal's face went red. "Mrs. Cooper, this is extremely inappropriate." I cut him off and pulled out my phone. "You know what? Let's see what the other parents think." I opened the parents' WhatsApp group. 247 members. I uploaded the audio file. "This is what they do to our special needs kids." My son Ethan begging for water. The principal lunged for my phone. "You can't share that. It's confidential school matters." But it was already sent. My phone was vibrating nonstop. "What the hell is this?" "Calling my lawyer right now. Everyone come to the school immediately." Parents were sharing the audio to other groups. The PTA Facebook, the District Parents Coalition, the Special Needs Support Network. Through the conference room window, I could see parents storming through the front entrance. The secretary's hands were shaking as she pressed buttons on her desk phone, while parents pushed past her desk and filled the narrow hallway outside the conference room. The district lawyer stood up and opened the door, trying to project calm authority, but 3 fathers immediately surrounded him, demanding to know what the hell was happening to their kids. More parents kept pouring through the main entrance, some still in work clothes, others in pajamas like they'd rushed straight from home. Mr. Davidson grabbed his briefcase and laptop, then slipped out the conference room's back door that connected to his private office. I watched him through the glass partition as he locked his office door from the inside and pulled the blinds shut. The lawyer was backing toward the wall as more parents pressed in, all talking at once, waving their phones with the audio still playing. I pulled out my phone and started recording everything, making sure to capture the lawyer's pale face and the way his hands trembled as he tried to speak over the crowd. The secretary had given up on the phone and was now standing behind her desk looking terrified as parents demanded to know where their children were right now. Within minutes, the school resource officer came running down the hall, his hand on his radio, shouting for everyone to clear the area immediately or face trespassing charges. Parents turned on him instantly, a mother shoving her phone in his face showing the audio timestamp, while her husband demanded to know if he'd known about the basement room. The SRO kept backing up, repeating that everyone needed to leave school property, but nobody was moving. I pushed through the crowd to where Miss Patricia was still sitting frozen in the conference room and told her I was taking Ethan home right now. She started to say something about dismissal procedures, but I cut her off and walked straight to Ethan's classroom. The SRO followed me, saying I couldn't just remove a student without signing him out, so I turned and asked if he really wanted to physically stop a mother from taking her abused child home while 20 other parents were filming us. He looked at all the phones pointed at him and stepped aside. Ethan was sitting at his desk staring at his dinosaur book, not even looking up at the chaos in the hallway. I gathered his backpack and lunchbox, then took his hand and led him through the crowd of parents who parted to let us through. That evening at home, Ethan sat at the dinner table moving his chicken nuggets around his plate without eating anything. I tried to get him to take just one bite, but he shook his head and kept his eyes down. 20 minutes into dinner, I smelled something and realized he'd wet himself again, just sitting there in silence. He didn't cry or react, just sat in his wet clothes staring at his plate. I helped him to the bathroom and got him cleaned up, then brought my camera to his room where the overhead light was brightest. The marks on his wrists were darker now, purple and yellow bruises in clear finger shapes where someone had grabbed him. I photographed them from every angle, then measured them with a ruler for scale. My hands shook so bad I had to retake several photos. I wrote everything in a notebook, the time, his behavior, how many words he'd spoken since pickup, which was 0. The next morning, I drove straight to the police station and walked up to the front desk saying I needed to file a report about child abuse at Central Elementary. The officer behind the glass looked bored and slid a form through the slot, saying I could fill it out in the waiting area. I pushed it back and said no. I needed to speak to someone immediately about multiple children being locked in a basement closet. He sighed and buzzed me through to a small interview room where another officer came in 10 minutes later with a notepad. He listened to my story with with obvious skepticism, interrupting to ask if I'd actually seen anyone lock my child anywhere, or if this was just something my son had said. I pulled out my phone and played 30 seconds of the audio, Ethan's voice sobbing and begging to go to the bathroom. The officer's whole face changed. He set down his pen and asked me to play it again from the beginning. After 4 minutes, he stopped me and said he needed to get a detective, that this would be handled as a priority case. He gave me an incident number and said someone would call within 48 hours. The next morning, my phone rang at 7:30, and a woman identified herself as Tess Donovan from Child Protective Services. She said they'd received multiple reports about Central Elementary and needed to schedule interviews with me and Ethan as soon as possible. She explained that they could investigate institutional neglect, but warned me that proving intentional abuse versus inappropriate discipline was much harder legally. She said the district would have lawyers and policies to hide behind, that these cases often went nowhere. I agreed to meet anyway, but felt my hope dimming as she talked about how long investigations took and how little power they really had over schools. That afternoon, I was folding laundry when my phone buzzed with an email from the school district's legal department. The subject line was "Cease and Desist, Confidential Student Records," and it was 3 pages of legal threats about privacy violations and defamation. I wonder what the real story is behind Miss Patricia sitting frozen in that conference room while chaos exploded around her. There's something about her silence that makes me curious about her actual role in all this darkness. They claimed I'd illegally recorded minor children without consent and damaged the reputation of dedicated educators with false allegations. They demanded I delete all recordings and posts immediately or face civil and criminal prosecution. My stomach turned to ice, but I forwarded it to 3 different lawyers I'd found online before even finishing reading it. That evening, I saw a notification for a new WhatsApp group called Central Parents Private with a message saying the main group was probably monitored by the district now. Within 2 hours, 12 different families had shared their own stories about their special needs, kids coming home with unexplained bruises or refusing to go to the school. One mother said her daughter had been having nightmares about a dark room for 2 years, but she'd thought it was just bad dreams. Another parent found drawings their son had hidden under his bed showing stick figures in black boxes labeled "Where Bad Kids Go." We realized this had been happening for years, and we'd all been given different explanations. Around 8 that night, I got a call from someone named Libby Duke, who said she was a special education advocate who'd been fighting the district for a decade. She'd heard about our situation from another parent and wanted to offer help pro bono because she'd seen this pattern before at other schools. She knew all the district's tactics, she said, how they'd try to intimidate us with legal threats while destroying evidence and coaching staff on what to say. I accepted immediately, desperate for someone who understood the system we were fighting. 2 days later, I took Ethan for an emergency appointment with a child psychologist my pediatrician had recommended. Ethan walked into her office clutching his dinosaur book, but when she gently asked about school, he dropped to the floor and crawled under her desk. She didn't force him out, just sat on the floor nearby and talked softly about how some places feel scary and that was okay. She documented all his symptoms in detail and started what she called a baseline assessment for trauma treatment. That evening, my phone rang with a blocked number and a man introduced himself as Jules Creech, an investigative journalist with the state newspaper. He said he'd been tracking complaints about isolation rooms in schools for months and had heard about our situation. He wanted to verify the audio and photos, but promised to protect our identities until we were ready to go public. He said he had similar evidence from 3 other districts and was building a larger story about systemic abuse of special needs students across the state. 2 days after talking to the reporter, I opened my email while Ethan was eating breakfast and saw the subject line that made my stomach drop. The district had placed Ethan on home instruction pending a safety review of his needs, effective immediately. They wrote it like they were doing us a favor, protecting him from further trauma, but I knew what this really was. They were kicking my kid out of school because I went public. I stared at the screen while Ethan munched his cereal, not knowing how to tell him he couldn't go back to see his friends or use the sensory room that actually helped him. My boss wasn't going to understand why I suddenly needed to work from home every day. I spent the morning calling around for tutors and trying to figure out how to teach a 3rd grader while handling conference calls. The next week, Tess from CPS showed up at our door with her clipboard and official badge. She seemed nice enough, kneeling down to Ethan's level and speaking softly, but he completely shut down the moment she started asking questions. He pressed himself against the wall and wouldn't make eye contact or respond to anything she said. She tried showing him pictures, using different voices, even pulling out some toys from her bag, but Ethan just stared at the floor and picked at his shirt. After an hour, she gave up and wrote notes about selective mutism and trauma response. She told me the limited disclosure made building a case harder, that kids who can't or won't talk about what happened often don't get justice. I wanted to grab her shoulders and shake her, make her understand that my baby was talking just fine before they started locking him in that closet. Meanwhile, Libby was working on the legal side, filing formal complaints with the state education department about violations of IDEA and 404 laws. She sent certified letters demanding all behavioral intervention plans, functional behavior assessments, and 3 years worth of incident reports. The district had 10 days to respond, but we both knew they'd use every second of that deadline. She warned me they'd probably claim records were lost or never existed. 3 days before the deadline, I got a call from the district's PR director asking me to come in for a resolution meeting. She sounded friendly, said they wanted to make things right for Ethan, but then she mentioned I'd need to sign some paperwork first. When I asked what kind of paperwork, she emailed me a non-disclosure agreement that was 12 pages long. The terms would prevent me from ever discussing anything about Ethan's education, his treatment at the school, or any settlement we might reach. I'd have to delete all my social media posts, destroy the recordings, and never speak to media again. For a moment, I actually considered it, just to make this nightmare end and get Ethan back in the school with proper support. But then I looked at him building with his blocks, humming to himself, and knew I couldn't let them silence us. Jules was hitting them from another angle with Freedom of Information Act requests for all seclusion and restraint logs from the past 5 years. He wanted to see patterns, how many other kids had been locked in those rooms. The district claimed they needed 30 days to compile the records, which he said was standard obstruction tactics. They were buying time to figure out what documents they absolutely had to provide, and which ones they could claim didn't exist. That's when I got the strangest email from an address I didn't recognize, just random numbers and letters at Gmail. The message was short, saying she'd seen what was happening to the special needs kids and couldn't stay quiet anymore. She signed it ND and said she was a teacher from another wing of the school. We exchanged a few careful messages before she suggested meeting at a grocery store parking lot 2 towns over where nobody would recognize us. I told my mom I was going shopping and drove 40 minutes to meet this woman who might have answers. officers. She was already there when I pulled up, sitting in an old Honda with tinted windows. Nell turned out to be in her 50s with gray streaks in her hair and tired eyes. She'd been teaching for 20 years and said she'd watched the isolation rooms become standard practice over the last decade. She named specific rooms I hadn't even known about, one in the gym storage area, another behind the music room. She described the scripts they were given for documentation, always writing that students were endangering themselves or others, never mentioning how long kids were kept in there. She told me about unwritten policies, how certain kids got labeled as problems and ended up in those rooms for things like stimming or crying. She showed me photos on her phone of incident reports she'd secretly photographed, proving they were doctoring the paperwork. Everything she described matched what we'd been finding. She was shaking as she talked, terrified of losing her pension if anyone found out she was talking to me. The next day, I took Ethan to his pediatrician for a full exam. Dr. Martinez had been seeing him since he was a baby and gasped when she saw the marks on his wrists. She documented everything with photographs, measured the bruising patterns, noted his weight loss and how he'd regressed in his speech and toilet training. She ran her fingers over the scratches on his arms where he'd been clawing at himself, something he'd never done before this started. She had tears in her eyes as she typed up her report, using medical terms like psychological trauma and developmental regression. She filed her own mandated reporter complaint with CPS that afternoon, adding medical documentation to support our case. I sat in my car afterward and cried with relief that finally a professional was validating what I'd been saying. Then the district made their first move, announcing that Miss Patricia was on administrative leave pending investigation, while Mr. Davidson remained in his position. The email to parents blamed individual lapses in judgment and promised retraining for staff. They were throwing Patricia under the bus while protecting the principal who'd created this whole system. The scapegoating made me so mad I threw my phone across the room. The worst part came in a district-wide email the next morning where they defended seclusion rooms as evidence-based behavioral interventions supported by research. They used all this clinical language about de-escalation spaces and therapeutic holds, making it sound like locking terrified kids in dark closets was some kind of medical treatment. They cited studies and included links to articles about managing aggressive behaviors, completely ignoring that most of these kids weren't aggressive at all, just overwhelmed or scared. The gaslighting was so obvious, but wrapped in enough professional terminology that some parents might actually believe it. The next morning, my phone was buzzing with messages from parents planning something big. They'd organized a sidewalk rally for that afternoon right outside the school during dismissal time. I showed up with Ethan staying at my mom's house since crowds would trigger him. Parents held signs saying, "Our kids deserve better," and "Stop the isolation rooms," while keeping to the public sidewalk. There's something odd about Nell meeting in a parking lot 2 towns over just to share information she could have emailed anonymously. Why risk showing her face at all if she's that worried about her pension? When someone handed me a megaphone, my hands were shaking, but my voice stayed steady. We're not here to attack anyone personally, but to demand systemic change for all special needs students. News vans pulled up within minutes, and reporters started interviewing parents. I kept repeating the same message about needing proper training and oversight, not blame. Back home that evening, Ethan had his worst meltdown yet when a car backfired outside. He screamed and threw himself under his bed, covering his ears and sobbing. The next day, I drove to 3 different stores buying noise-canceling headphones, blackout curtains, and 2 weighted blankets. I installed the curtains in his room and the living room, turning our house into a dark, quiet cave. We barely slept anymore since every little sound sent him into panic mode. Tess called me frustrated because when she showed up to inspect the basement rooms, the principal said they were doing maintenance work and she couldn't enter. She filed paperwork for a court order but warned me the process would take weeks. I knew they were down there destroying evidence while we waited for bureaucracy to catch up. Libby was having her own battles with the district, refusing to schedule an emergency IEP meeting. She sent them a formal 10-day notice for unilateral placement, which meant we could enroll Ethan somewhere else and make them pay if they didn't respond. Finally, we had some leverage to force their hand. Jules texted me photos of the FOIA response she'd gotten, hundreds of pages with most of it blacked out, but what wasn't redacted made me run to the bathroom to throw up. The numbers showed seclusion rooms used 847 times just last year, 847 kids locked in those rooms, and nobody said anything. That evening, Nell sent me a photo from her car showing workers at the school loading the B12 door sign into a truck. They were literally painting over the door and removing any trace it existed. I saved everything with timestamps and started backing up all our evidence. I uploaded every photo, recording, and document to 3 different cloud services that night. Then I copied everything onto USB drives and mailed one to my sister in another state, one to my cousin, and kept one in a safety deposit box. Jules said the metadata showing when files were created would be crucial for proving they destroyed evidence after we reported it. 2 days later, a police car pulled into my driveway. The school resource officer stood at my door looking uncomfortable. "Mrs. Cooper, I've been asked to inform you that entering school property again will result in immediate arrest for trespassing." I pulled out my phone and started recording. "Are you threatening me for advocating for my disabled child?" He shifted his weight and looked away. "Just delivering the message, ma'am." After he left, I forwarded the video to Libby, who said it was clear intimidation. The next morning, Libby called excited because a national disability rights organization had reached out. They wanted to file an amicus brief if we pursued litigation and had won similar cases in 3 other states. Their legal team was offering pro bono assistance, which meant free help from lawyers who knew exactly how to fight these battles. The network of support kept growing beyond just our local parents. More evidence kept coming in from other families, including photos of bruises, recordings of kids crying, and medical records showing anxiety diagnoses after starting at Central Elementary. Meanwhile, I had to focus on getting Ethan help. The psychologist finally completed her evaluation after 3 sessions. She diagnosed him with acute stress disorder and recommended he not return to Central Elementary under any circumstances. Insurance would only cover 12 sessions total, which meant 9 more visits. I'd figure out how to pay for more treatment later, but at least now we had official documentation that the school had hurt him. Ethan still wouldn't talk about what happened in that room. He'd just shake his head and hide under his weighted blanket whenever I tried to ask. The psychologist said forcing him to talk could make the trauma worse, so we had to wait until he felt safe enough. Some nights he'd wake up screaming, "I'll be good," over and over until I held him and promised he never had to go back there. The principal sent another letter full of legal language about how they were conducting an internal investigation and would implement new training protocols. More empty promises wrapped in fancy words while they covered their tracks. Parents kept messaging me with their own horror stories and asking what they could do to help. We started a private Facebook group that grew to over 300 members in 2 days. Everyone shared sharing evidence and comparing notes about what their kids had experienced. The pattern was clear that they targeted the most vulnerable kids who couldn't defend themselves or clearly communicate what was happening. 2 days later, I got a letter from the district's lawyer saying I was now classified as a disruptive parent and couldn't contact any school staff directly anymore. Everything had to go through their legal department, which meant more delays and more paperwork while kids kept suffering. I scanned the letter and added it to our growing file of evidence showing how they were trying to silence us instead of fixing the problem. The other parents in our Facebook group got similar letters, and we realized they were trying to isolate us from each other and from any teachers who might want to help. My phone rang while I was reading through more parent messages, and it was Ansel from work asking me to come in for a meeting about all the days I'd been missing. I sat across from him in his office while he explained that the company understood family emergencies, but I'd used up all my sick days and vacation time already. They could offer FMLA leave, but it would be unpaid, and we needed my paycheck to cover Ethan's new therapy sessions that insurance wouldn't touch. I had to choose between keeping my job to pay for his treatment or being there to fight the school, and I felt trapped either way. That night, I opened our savings account and transferred everything we'd saved for our vacation to the checking account to pay for private occupational therapy. The next morning, I went to the pawn shop with my grandmother's jewelry that she'd left me when she died and got $300 for pieces that meant everything to me. We canceled our cable and internet, keeping just basic phone service, and I started skipping lunch to save that money for Ethan's sessions. Every penny we could scrape together went toward helping him recover from what they'd done to him in that basement room. Tess called to tell me CPS finally got their court order to inspect the school's basement, but the district was stalling with claims about construction permits and asbestos testing that would take weeks to complete. She sounded frustrated, but said her hands were tied and they had to follow proper procedures, even though we all knew the district was just buying time to clean things up. More waiting while other kids were probably still being locked in those rooms, and there was nothing we could do about it legally. Jules sent me a draft of his article before it went live, and seeing everything written out with quotes from 7 different families made it real in a way that was hard to process. The next morning, his story was on the front page of the newspaper's website, with the audio transcript excerpts and photos we'd taken of the scratches inside that closet. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times, and the school's phones were ringing non-stop with angry calls from people across the state demanding answers. The exposure felt good, but also scary because now everyone knew our story, and I worried about backlash against Ethan. The school board announced a special meeting for the following Tuesday with strict rules about public comments being limited to 2 minutes each and no visual aids or recordings allowed. They were clearly trying to control the narrative and prevent us from showing the evidence we'd gathered, but we decided to prepare anyway. Every word would have to count in those 2 minutes, and we needed to make them impossible to ignore. Libby came over that weekend to help me write a statement that would fit the time limit but still convey the horror of what they'd done to our kids. We practiced over and over until I could deliver it without breaking down, because controlled anger would be more powerful than sobbing through it. She timed me with her phone while I stood in my living room reciting the words we'd carefully chosen to maximum impact. Tuesday night, the auditorium was packed with parents and media, and you could feel the tension in the air as the board members took their seats looking uncomfortable. When my turn came, I walked to the microphone and started playing the audio of Ethan crying and begging for water before the board's lawyer jumped up yelling about privacy concerns. He reached over and cut my microphone, but those 30 seconds of my baby's voice had already filled the room, and parents were shouting in anger while board members shifted in their seats. The crowd erupted with people standing up and demanding they turn the mic back on, but the board president just called for order and moved to the next speaker. Vicky Davenport took the microphone next and described finding similar marks on her daughter's wrists after she'd been kept in isolation in a different grade with completely different staff members. The pattern was clear now that this wasn't just one bad teacher, but a systematic problem throughout the school, and board members couldn't pretend anymore that these were isolated incidents. Parents around the room were nodding and whispering to each other as more pieces of the puzzle came together, showing how widespread this abuse really was. Something feels calculated about how the district lawyer just happened to cut that microphone right when Ethan's voice filled the room. They knew exactly what they were doing to control this meeting. The union representative stood up and argued that teachers hadn't been properly trained on how to handle special needs students, and they were just following what they thought were approved procedures. She kept shifting blame to district policies and lack of resources while defending individual teachers, saying they were doing their best in difficult circumstances. It made me sick hearing her act like locking terrified children in dark closets was somehow understandable because of budget problems or training gaps, when any decent human being would know that was wrong. The public comment section started, and Tess stood up from her seat near the back. She walked straight to the microphone and pulled out her badge. She said CPS was actively investigating, and anyone with information should contact her office immediately. The board members started shifting in their seats and looking at each other. More parents lined up behind her to speak. Each one told their story about their child being locked in that room. Some had photos of bruises and scratches. Others had medical records showing anxiety diagnoses that started after their kids entered Central. The board president kept trying to cut people off, saying their 3 minutes were up. Parents just kept talking over him. Security guards moved closer but didn't actually do anything. The meeting went on for 4 hours until they finally called it closed. The next morning, my phone started buzzing at 6 a.m. with texts from other parents. The local news website had posted that Davidson was on administrative leave pending investigation. The district released a statement saying they were cooperating fully, but still wouldn't admit anything was wrong. It felt like such a small win after everything they'd done to our kids. 2 days later, I got an email from a law firm representing Patricia. They demanded I remove all posts mentioning her name from social media within 24 hours or face legal action. The letter claimed I was defaming her character and causing emotional distress. I screenshot it and posted it to the parent group asking for advice. Within an hour, 12 other parents had gotten the same letter. Some immediately deleted their posts because they couldn't afford a lawsuit. Others changed Patricia's name to Miss P in their posts. The fear was spreading through our group. Then Jules texted me a screenshot someone had leaked to him. It was an internal district email marked urgent, requiring all staff to preserve any documents related to seclusion rooms or behavioral interventions. The email specifically mentioned anticipated litigation and regulatory investigations. Jules added it to his follow-up article that afternoon. The district's lawyers were clearly preparing for something big. That same night, Ethan woke up screaming at 2 a.m. He was soaked in sweat and shaking, so hard his teeth were chattering. I held him and rocked him, but nothing helped. The screaming went on for 3 hours straight. I logged everything in the notebook his treatment team had given me, the time it started, what might have triggered it, how long it lasted. This was the 5th night in a row. I was running on maybe 2 hours of sleep and could barely function. Coffee wasn't even helping anymore. My hands shook constantly from exhaustion. Work was calling asking when I'd be back, but I couldn't leave Ethan alone. During one of Ethan's therapy sessions, Libby called with news. She'd found a spot at a therapeutic day program one district over. They had special rooms with soft lighting and no locks. The staff were trained in working with kids who had trauma. It wasn't perfect, and insurance would only cover part of it, but it was better than keeping Ethan home forever. We scheduled a tour for the next week. The drive took 45 minutes, but Ethan stayed calm listening to his dinosaur podcast. The building looked nothing like Central. Everything was painted in soft colors with lots of windows. The director met us at the door and got down on Ethan's level to introduce herself. She showed us the sensory room with its bubble tubes and weighted blankets. The quiet space had beanbags and soft music, with the door always open. Staff explained how they used picture cards to help kids communicate when they were upset. They showed us the schedule board where everything was predictable and clear. Ethan stayed pressed against my leg the whole time. He didn't have a total meltdown though, which felt like progress. They suggested starting with just a few hours to see how he did. The next Monday, we tried a half-day visit. I sat in my car in the parking lot the whole time with my phone ready. After an hour, they texted that Ethan was doing okay. He'd gotten scared when the bell rang, but the aide had given him noise-canceling headphones. At snack time, he'd eaten his crackers at a table by himself while the aide sat nearby. No one forced him to join group activities. After 3 hours, they called saying he was getting tired and should probably go home. When I picked him up, he wasn't crying or scratched up. He even said bye to the aide. It was the first positive school experience we'd had in months. We kept doing half-days for 2 weeks, slowly building up his tolerance. Meanwhile, the district's insurance company reached out through our lawyer. They wanted to meet about a possible settlement. The number they offered was insulting, barely enough to cover Ethan's therapy bills. Plus, we'd have to sign papers saying we wouldn't sue or talk publicly about what happened. No admission of wrongdoing and no promise to change their policies. They just wanted this to go away cheap and quiet. I wanted to tell them exactly where to shove their offer, but part of me wondered if I should take it for Ethan's therapy. The decision was tearing me apart. Then Tess called with an update. CPS had finished their investigation and substantiated institutional neglect. She was referring the findings to the DA's office for possible criminal charges, but she warned me not to get my hopes up because proving intent was almost impossible. The system protected itself even with mountains of evidence. 2 days later, Nell sent me screenshots of the affidavit she'd filed with the state board detailing everything she'd witnessed in B12. Within hours, she was getting called into meetings with union reps who kept reminding her about solidarity and not breaking ranks. Other teachers stopped eating lunch with her, and suddenly her lesson plans needed extra review from admin. She texted me photos of passive-aggressive notes left in her mailbox about team loyalty and protecting the school's reputation. By Friday, she was sending out resumes to districts 3 counties over because the principal's secretary told her that her contract probably wouldn't be renewed next year. I watched this woman sacrifice her career for telling the truth about what they did to my son and could only send her gift cards for gas money while she drove to interviews. The following week, Tess called with news from the DA's office that made me throw my phone across the kitchen. They weren't filing criminal charges because there was insufficient evidence of criminal intent, and the isolation room usage fell into a gray area of poor professional judgment rather than prosecutable abuse. The prosecutor's letter said policy violations were a civil matter for the school board to handle internally and recommended we pursue administrative remedies through proper channels. I drove to the courthouse and demanded to see someone higher up, but the receptionist just handed me another copy of the same letter and said the decision was final. The rage burned so hot I had to sit in my car for 20 minutes before I could drive home safely. 3 days after that disappointment, an official envelope arrived from the state education department announcing they were opening a compliance review of the district's special education practices. The letter said Central Elementary had 60 days to submit a corrective action plan addressing the violations identified in their preliminary investigation. Libby called it bureaucratic theater, but said having it on record would help our civil case because it established a pattern of non-compliance with federal disability laws. I spent that afternoon scanning every page and uploading them to the shared folder she'd created for evidence. The next Monday, I met Vicky and another mom whose daughter had also been locked in B12 at Libby's office to sign paperwork for a civil lawsuit. The retainer agreement made my stomach drop because we'd need $5,000 just to start and potentially tens of thousands if it went to trial. Libby explained we were seeking both monetary damages for the trauma and an injunction to prevent them from using isolation rooms ever again. Vicky's husband had already taken out a loan against their 401k, and the other family was selling their boat to cover legal fees. I signed knowing we didn't have the money, but someone had to make them pay for what they'd done. 2 weeks into March, Mr. Davidson announced his retirement effective immediately for personal reasons. The school board approved his exit package with full pension and health benefits, plus a glowing letter of recommendation for his years of dedicated service. Miss Patricia got transferred to a curriculum development position at the district office with the same salary and no student contact. Not one word about why these sudden changes happened or any admission that they'd done anything wrong. Parents were posting angry comments on the district Facebook page, but they kept deleting them and eventually turned off comments entirely. The next week, the district sent out a press release about converting the basement storage areas into supply rooms as part of their proactive improvements to learning environments. They hired a photographer to take pictures of B12 filled with boxes of printer paper and cleaning supplies, like it had never been anything else. Patricia getting a cushy district office job with the same pay makes me question who she knows at the top. Davidson's golden parachute retirement package seems awfully generous for someone under CPS investigation. The timing of these personal reasons feels too convenient. The gaslighting made me physically sick watching them pretend they were making positive changes instead of covering up years of abuse. They even quoted the superintendent talking about their commitment to excellence and creating safe spaces for all learners. Meanwhile, Ethan started at the therapeutic day program 3 mornings a week, while I drove him to private occupational therapy on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Some days he'd line up his dinosaur toys and tell me facts about velociraptors for an hour straight, which felt like having my old son back. Other days I'd find him hiding in the bedroom closet with his hands over his ears rocking back and forth. The therapist said trauma recovery wasn't linear, and we had to celebrate small victories like him asking to use the bathroom instead of having accidents. Progress meant him sleeping through one night without screaming or eating lunch without checking under the table first. My boss cut my hours to part-time after I missed too many shifts for therapy appointments and court meetings. We sold my car to cover 2 months of therapy bills bills, and I started taking the bus to work at 5 in the morning. I joined local buy-nothing groups asking for weighted blankets and sensory toys, swallowing my pride when neighbors dropped off bags of hand-me-down therapeutic equipment on our porch. One woman slipped an envelope with $200 cash under a box of fidget toys with a note saying she was sorry for what happened. The community support helped, but losing half my income while therapy costs tripled was drowning us in debt. The town split hard over the lawsuit, with people taking sides in grocery store aisles and soccer game sidelines. Former friends would see me at the pharmacy and suddenly remember they needed something in another aisle. Parents who used to arrange playdates stopped responding to texts, and Ethan's birthday party invitations got ignored. The PTA president told me I wasn't welcome at meetings anymore because my presence was disruptive to the school unity. Meanwhile, other parents would grab my arm at pickup and whisper thank you for fighting when they were too scared to speak up. 6 months after his first article, Jules called to tell me he'd won a regional journalism award for his investigation into isolation room abuse. The story had been picked up by education advocacy groups nationwide, but local media had already moved on to covering budget debates and football season. He mailed me a framed copy of the award with a note saying the documentation would matter for future families, even if the news cycle had forgotten us. At least someone would remember what really happened in that basement room when the district tried to pretend it never existed. 2 weeks later, the CPS investigator showed up at my door with a thick folder and a tired expression. She sat at my kitchen table flipping through pages while I made coffee with shaking hands. She pushed the report across to me and pointed to the findings section where it said, "Neglect substantiated," in bold letters. The investigator explained they could offer trauma therapy referrals for Ethan and recommend policy changes to the district. I asked what would actually force the school to stop using isolation rooms. She looked down at her coffee and said CPS could only investigate and recommend, but had no power to make the district do anything. The most they could do was add this to the school's record and hope the district would listen to their suggestions. I slammed my hand on the table so hard the coffee cups jumped. She handed me a list of therapists who specialized in trauma recovery and left without making eye contact. 3 days later, my lawyer called saying the district wanted to settle. I drove to his office where he had papers spread across his conference table showing their offer. They would cover all of Ethan's therapy costs plus additional damages, but there was a catch. The settlement included a limited confidentiality clause that meant I couldn't discuss specific settlement amounts or terms. My lawyer explained we could still talk about the abuse itself, just not the financial details. He said we could fight it in court, but that would take years, and Ethan needed help now, not when he was 11. I stared at the number on the paper, knowing other families were still fighting their own battles. My lawyer reminded me that getting Ethan treatment was the priority, and the settlement would guarantee he got the best care immediately. I picked up a pen, feeling like I was betraying every other parent whose kid was still suffering. The pen felt heavy as I signed my name on each page. My lawyer filed the papers that afternoon while I sat in my car crying because taking their money felt like letting them win, even though I knew Ethan needed the therapy more than I needed my pride. The next morning, the district sent out an email blast announcing new policies. They were banning all use of seclusion rooms effective immediately and requiring mandatory crisis intervention training for all staff. The email made it sound like they were being progressive leaders instead of being forced into it by lawsuits and media pressure. Davidson was quoted saying the district was committed to supporting all students with compassion and evidence-based practices. I wanted to throw my phone, but at least the rooms would be gone even if they were pretending it was their idea. Later that week, Nell texted me that she'd been transferred to a school across town. She said the official reason was staffing needs, but everyone knew it was punishment for speaking up. Her new principal treated her like a troublemaker from day one, and other teachers avoided her in the hallways. She sent another text saying she'd do it all again because at least those rooms were finally gone. 2 months passed with Ethan going to therapy twice a week. One Tuesday night, I was folding laundry when I realized it was past 9 and Ethan was still asleep. I crept to his door and peeked in to see him sleeping peacefully without his dinosaur nightlight for the first time since everything happened. I stood there watching him breathe steadily with no signs of nightmares. The next night, the terrors came back and he wet the bed again. But that one peaceful night showed me healing was possible even if it wasn't a straight line. I started writing about our experience on my laptop while Ethan was at therapy. I typed out everything I wished I'd known about recognizing institutional abuse and navigating the system. I included warning signs to watch for and questions parents should ask. I posted it on my blog that usually only had recipes and vacation photos. Within days, my inbox was full of messages from parents saying the post helped them recognize what was happening to their own kids. One mom said she'd printed it out and brought it to her IEP meeting. Another dad said it gave him the courage to file a complaint about his daughter's school. Each message made me feel like maybe something good could come from our nightmare. I cleared out a shelf in my bedroom closet and put a box there with everything from this fight. The photos of room B12 went in first, followed by the audio recorder I'd given Ethan. I added copies of every email and document plus the CPS report and settlement papers. My husband asked why I was keeping it all when it was over. I told him it wasn't dwelling but staying ready because they'd hurt my baby once, and I'd never trust any school completely again. Every time I put Ethan on the bus, I thought about that box and promised myself I'd burn the whole system down before I'd let anyone lock him in a dark room again. Alright, that's a wrap from me. Really appreciate you sticking around while I poked at all those questions. Hopefully my wondering was at least a little useful. Catch you in the next one. Like the video. It helps more than you think.